At my daughter's birthday dinner, my son-in-law leaned in and called me a useless old fool. He laughed, saying one day my money would finally serve a purpose. Later this I found my safe key missing. I stayed calm, but I set a trap. When glitter exploded all over him at 3 a.m., my daughter's world shattered. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Edward Miller had lived in his quiet neighborhood for more than 15 years, and in all that time, the greatest drama had been Mrs. Henderson's cat getting stuck in a maple tree. His house was his fortress of routine, every drawer and cabinet meticulously organized, every door locked with care. It was a home built not just of bricks and wood, but of patterns and order, habits shaped over decades of solitary living. That was why on that particular evening, when his son-in-law's words sliced through the dinner table chatter, something inside Edward shifted. The fork froze halfway to his mouth when Mark Johnson looked across the table with a smile that never quite touched his eyes. "So, Edward," he said, his tone deceptively casual, "that safe you keep upstairs, what kind of lock does it have?" Rachel, Edward's daughter, nearly choked on her water. "Mark, what kind of question is that?" Her cheeks colored with embarrassment, but her husband's gaze didn't leave Edward's face. Mark's eyes gleamed with something predatory, something hungry. He leaned forward, elbows planted on the oak dining table as if staking a claim. Edward carefully set down his fork, buying time while his chest tightened with unease. "Just curious about home security," Mark went on, his smile widening in practiced charm. "You know, with all the break-ins happening around here lately." Edward frowned. "What break-ins? This neighborhood hasn't seen a police car in months." Mark waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, you probably don't hear about them. People like to keep it quiet, avoid panic, you know?" There was a gleam in his eye that made Edward's stomach clench. He studied his son-in-law more closely, watching the way his fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the polished wood, the way his pupils expanded slightly at the mention of Edward's possible demise. "But a man your age, living alone in a house this size," Mark pressed, "you must have some serious security measures, right? And what about insurance? I mean, if something happened to you, God forbid, Rachel would need to know where everything important is kept." The air thickened. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her chair, glancing between them with confusion etched across her brow. "Dad's always been careful," she said, her voice thin, trying to soothe. Edward allowed a small nod. "I have everything organized. Rachel knows what she needs to know." Mark leaned back, his smile tightening. "But does she know about the key?" The question lingered like smoke. Rachel's brows drew together. "What key?" she asked softly. "The one in your father's drawer upstairs," Mark said smoothly. Edward's chair scraped against the floor as his body tensed. "And how exactly do you know about any key in my bedroom?" His voice carried an edge he hadn't intended, sharp enough to cut. For just a moment, the mask cracked. A cold, calculating flicker passed over Mark's features before his expression softened again into the role of the concerned son-in-law. "Oh, that. Last week I had a terrible headache. Rachel told me to check the bathroom cabinet for aspirin, but I must have opened the wrong drawer by mistake. Sorry, Edward, I didn't mean to invade your privacy." Rachel nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "That's right. I remember that headache. You were miserable." Edward remembered too, but differently. Mark had vanished upstairs for nearly half an hour that evening, complaining of stomach troubles after dinner. Long enough to do more than fumble for a bottle of aspirin. "The aspirin's in the medicine cabinet," Edward said quietly, his voice steady, his eyes locked on Mark. "It always has been." Mark's jaw tightened just slightly, a subtle tick almost hidden beneath his charm. "Guess I was really out of it from the pain," he murmured, but Edward wasn't fooled. The rest of dinner limped forward, conversation strained, Mark circling back again and again, with questions that felt less like curiosity and more like reconnaissance. He asked about Edward's banking habits, who else might have keys to the house, what time he usually retired for bed. Each question was another probing finger pressing into a wound Edward hadn't realized he carried. When the meal ended, Rachel jumped to her feet, eager to clear dishes and dissolve the tension. "I'll take care of cleanup tonight, Dad. You cooked." "I don't mind," Edward replied, already stacking plates with the familiar rhythm of his evening ritual. Washing and drying dishes was more than a chore. It was a way of ordering his thoughts. Tonight, he needed the rhythm badly. "Come on, honey," Mark said quickly, guiding Rachel toward the stairs with a hand already on her shoulder. "Let your dad handle his kitchen. We should get some rest." Their bedroom door clicked shut upstairs while Edward stood at the sink, water rushing over porcelain. His hands moved automatically. Wash, rinse, dry. But his mind replayed every detail of the evening. Mark's sharp eyes, his subtle slips, his invasive knowledge about the key that should have remained a secret. The house, once safe and familiar, felt exposed. He thought of the 30 minutes Mark had spent upstairs, sick, of the probing questions, of the hunger behind his smile. Piece by piece, the red flags Edward had pushed aside over the past weeks fell into place like jagged puzzle pieces, forming a sinister picture. By the time he dried the last glass and hung the towel neatly back on its hook, his decision was made. Something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer about hospitality, no longer about trusting Rachel's choice of husband. This was about survival, about protecting his home, his life's work, and his daughter from a man who had just shown his true colors. Edward climbed the stairs slowly, his hand gripping the banister tighter than usual. The first thing he noticed was his bedroom door. It stood slightly ajar, 2 inches of darkness spilling into the hall. He always closed it. Always. A chill spread through him. Mark and Rachel were in the guest room. There was no reason, none, for anyone to be in his bedroom. Edward paused at the top step, listening. The old house gave its usual settling groans, but beneath it, silence. No movement, no sound from down the hall. His heart hammered in his chest, every instinct honed by 30 years of investigating other people's lies, telling him that his sanctuary had been violated. He pushed the door open slowly, hinges whisper silent. Everything looked in place at first glance. The bed neatly made, the lamp angled as always, his glasses resting on the nightstand. But Edward's eyes had been trained for decades to see the things others overlooked. The closet door hung open by 4 inches. A dresser drawer sat uneven, a manila folder corner peeking like a tongue from careless hands. And the brass key he had hidden with precision beneath the drawer's lip was gone. Gone. His pulse spiked, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with rage. Mark Johnson had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What he had assumed was a house guest was in truth a predator. And Edward Miller was no man's prey. Edward Miller did not sleep that night. He lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling, listening to the small, familiar sounds of the house. The low hum of the refrigerator 2 floors below, the occasional groan of settling wood, the faint rustle of trees outside. Yet every creak seemed sharper, every whisper of the wind more deliberate. He had lived alone for years before Rachel returned with her husband, and silence had always been a comfort. But tonight it felt like the silence was watching him, waiting. At 11:47 p.m., the quiet fractured. Soft, deliberate footsteps moved across the living room floor beneath him. Not Rachel. Her steps were light, almost airy, even when she was half asleep. These were heavier, measured, the movements of someone who knew how to be careful. Edward's breath slowed, his instincts sharpening. Then came the voice, low, hushed, but distinct. "Yeah, it's me. Everyone's asleep." "Mark." Edward eased himself from his bed, careful not to let the mattress creak. He padded barefoot across the cold hardwood until he reached the heating vent near the corner of the room. Sound had a way of carrying through the old ducts. He crouched, pressing his ear close, his body tense as a bowstring. "The old man's definitely loaded." Mark's whisper floated upward, clearer now. "I found bank statements, investment portfolios, the whole thing. We're talking serious money here." Edward's blood ran cold, then hot. His jaw tightened as he pressed his palm against the floor, steadying himself. "We'll do it tomorrow night," Mark continued. "Rachel's got her book club, 7 to 9. Perfect timing. I already have the safe key. I grabbed it earlier this week. The fool keeps everything important in there. Cash, jewelry, probably more accounts. Piece of cake." Edward reached slowly for his phone on the nightstand. His hand shook as he opened the voice recorder, thumb hovering before pressing record. The voice below grew more animated, more desperate. Look, I don't have a choice. My gambling debts aren't going anywhere, and those guys aren't exactly patient. This has to happen now. The words confirmed everything Edward had suspected and more. This wasn't opportunistic greed. This was desperation. Mark was tangled in debts big enough to bring dangerous people into the picture. Edward kept the recorder running, his heart pounding as each sentence condemned the man sleeping in the next room. David's just some lonely old widower, Mark sneered, his voice dripping contempt. He has no idea what's coming. Hell, he was practically giving me information at dinner tonight. The beauty is, he'll never suspect family. Even if he notices something's missing, Rachel will convince him he misplaced it. You know how old people get about their memory. Edward's teeth clenched. Old? He was 66, not senile. His memory was sharp enough to recall every insult in perfect detail. Trust me, Mark's voice hissed. By Thursday, we're gone. I'll tell Rachel I got a job offer out of state. Something urgent. She'll believe it. We'll be out before the old man knows what hit him. A pause, then a laugh. Cold, humorless, and ugly. Maybe he should have been more careful about who he let into his house. Life lesson, right? The call ended. Silence stretched for a moment before Edward heard footsteps again, cautious and quiet, moving toward the stairs. He darted back into bed, sliding the phone under his pillow, forcing his body into stillness. Through the slight gap of his cracked bedroom door, he watched shadows shift along the hallway. Mark's silhouette drifted past, pausing for a second outside Edward's room. Then came the faint creak of the guest room door opening and closing. Edward stayed motionless, his breathing measured, until the silence settled again. His hand brushed the phone beneath his pillow, the recording safe and undeniable. The evidence was there, clear as daylight. Mark wasn't just a bad husband. He was a predator with debts snapping at his heels, and tomorrow night he planned to betray them both. Edward for his money, Rachel for her trust. Sleep was impossible. Edward lay staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning through memories. Rachel's call 3 weeks ago came back in painful clarity, her voice strained and frightened as she told him Mark had lost his job and they were 3 months behind on the mortgage. She had begged for help without quite saying the words. Edward had said yes immediately, without hesitation, his heart breaking at the thought of his daughter in distress. The relief in her voice had been palpable, almost childlike. His little girl, 32 years old now, but still the same Rachel who once ran through these halls in pigtails, had clung to him in gratitude when she arrived on the doorstep. She had whispered thank you over and over, eyes shining with tears. But Mark had walked in differently. His handshake was firm but empty, his eyes scanning the house with something that wasn't appreciation. It was appraisal. Nice place, Edward, he'd said that first day, looking around the living room like a man measuring furniture for resale. Must be worth a fortune in today's market. Edward had shrugged it off as curiosity, eager to keep peace for Rachel's sake. But now he could see the truth in every moment he had dismissed. Mark's endless questions about his banking habits, his interest in neighbors' routines, his casual offers to help Edward with errands at the bank, his insistence on knowing about the safe, about locks, about insurance. It all clicked into place with brutal clarity. Edward turned onto his side, gripping the phone tight, the glow of the screen illuminating his lined face. He replayed the recording, the sound of Mark's voice filling the dark. Each word was a betrayal, not just of him, but of Rachel. She trusted her husband. She believed his stories about unemployment, about prospects, about the struggles they faced together. She had no idea her husband was drowning in gambling debts, no idea he was already planning their escape built on theft and lies. Edward's heart ached for her, but pity hardened into resolve. He was not helpless, he was not senile, and he was certainly not the easy target Mark thought him to be. The years he had spent as an insurance investigator had taught him 100 ways to catch a liar, 1,000 ways to trap a thief. Desperation made men careless, and Mark had already slipped more than once. Tomorrow night, Mark Johnson thought he would rob an old man in his sleep. Instead, he would discover that some old men were sharper than knives and far less forgiving. Edward stared into the darkness, planning every detail. He would not confront Mark outright, not yet. He would let the man think he was safe, that his secret remained hidden. He would let him walk right into the trap. And when the time came, justice would not just fall, it would explode. The old man everyone underestimated was not asleep. He was sharpening his resolve. Mark Johnson had whispered to his accomplice that Edward Miller was nothing more than a lonely old widower, an easy target, too blind to see betrayal standing right in front of him. But Edward's eyes had never been sharper. That insult ignited something inside him, a fire he hadn't felt in years. He would not be humiliated. He would not be robbed. And he would not let his daughter's life be ruined by a man who thought deceit was easier than honesty. 3 weeks earlier, Rachel had called him in tears. Edward remembered that morning with perfect clarity, his coffee growing cold, the newspaper unread as her voice cracked through the phone line. "Dad, I hate to ask, but could we maybe stay with you for a while? Just until Mark finds something new?" She had tried so hard to sound strong, but Edward heard the tremor underneath. Behind her words was the desperation of a woman drowning, clutching at the only man she could still trust. He hadn't hesitated. "Of course," he said. "This is your home. Always." When she arrived, she'd hugged him so tightly he thought his ribs might crack. She whispered her gratitude over and over. But Mark had stepped over the threshold differently. His eyes roamed the house like a surveyor plotting blueprints. His handshake was perfunctory, his smile quick and hollow. He had said, "Nice place," in the same tone other men appraised cars at auctions. Now, in the still darkness of his bedroom, Edward pieced every moment together like a puzzle he should have solved sooner. The long headache that had kept Mark upstairs for 30 minutes. The sudden interest in insurance. The questions about neighbors' habits, about spare keys, about how Edward managed his accounts. All of it was reconnaissance, and Edward cursed himself for dismissing the signs in favor of keeping peace for Rachel. But guilt was useless now. Strategy was what mattered. He lay awake, his pulse steadying, as his mind shifted into the familiar mode of investigation. He remembered fraudsters from his working days, men who thought themselves clever, men undone by their own arrogance. Desperation always cracked the mask. Mark's gambling debts were not just a weakness, they were the chain dragging him towards self-destruction. Edward decided then and there, if Mark wanted to play a game, he would give him one. The following morning, Edward moved through his kitchen with the same deliberate rhythm as always. Eggs frying, coffee brewing, toast browning just right. Rachel wandered in, hair still tangled from sleep, smiling gratefully at the smell. "Morning, Dad." "Morning, sweetheart." He kissed her cheek, hiding the storm that raged beneath his calm exterior. Mark arrived 20 minutes later, showered and polished, as though nothing foul had slipped from his mouth hours before. He greeted Edward with forced cheer. "Beautiful day. What's everyone got planned?" Edward handed him a steaming mug of coffee, his expression unreadable. "Oh, the usual. Might run some errands later. Hardware store, maybe the bank." He watched closely. A muscle twitched near Mark's left eye. It was subtle, but Edward had built a career on catching subtle. "You're careful, Edward," Mark said with exaggerated approval. "It's smart. Identity theft, scams. You can't be too cautious at your age." "At your age." The phrase landed like a slap, but Edward only nodded. "That's right. Caution keeps a man safe." As Rachel busied herself with dishes, Mark leaned closer, his voice syrup smooth. "Speaking of safety, you do keep important things in that safe upstairs, don't you?" Edward took a slow sip of coffee, feigning thoughtfulness. "Some things, yes." "What about cash? I mean, with the banks always one disaster away, it's smart to keep something on hand, don't you think?" Edward smiled faintly. "I have what I need." Mark's eyes glinted, but he said nothing more. That afternoon, Edward drove to the hardware store, his hands steady on the wheel though his thoughts raced ahead. He walked through the aisles until he found what he wanted in the party supply section, a spring-loaded confetti cannon. He also purchased a bag of ultra-fine glitter, the kind that clings to everything it touches. Silver and gold. If Mark wanted to be a thief, he would leave marked like one. Back home, with Rachel and Mark out shopping, Edward set to work in his basement workshop. The cannon came apart easily under his practiced hands. He filled it with glitter instead of paper confetti, testing the mechanism until it released in a perfect burst when sufficient pressure was applied. Not too light, casual touch wouldn't trigger it, but precise enough that someone reaching deliberately into the back of his dresser drawer would pay the price. He positioned the device carefully, camouflaging it with old photographs and buttons. A dummy key lay in plain sight, an old luggage key similar enough to fool a hurried thief. Anyone reaching for it would unleash the storm. After several tests, Edward reset the mechanism and stepped back. The drawer looked ordinary, innocent, but it was armed, and then he went further. At an electronics store, he purchased a compact wireless camera with night vision. By late afternoon, it was mounted discreetly between books on his nightstand, its lens aimed at the dresser. The feed displayed perfectly on his phone, clear, sharp, ready to capture every incriminating detail. When Rachel and Mark returned, Edward greeted them with a warm smile concealing his satisfaction. The trap was set. Mark believed the old man was blind, but Edward had already drawn the battlefield. That night over dinner, Mark made one last attempt to press alcohol on him, suggesting a drink together. Bonding, he called it. Edward declined, claiming his medication did not allow it. When Mark pushed again, Edward added, "That's why I take sleeping pills instead. They knock me out cold." Relief flashed across Mark's face, too quick for Rachel to catch. Edward tucked the moment into memory. Later, he moved through his nightly routine deliberately, leaving his bedroom door slightly ajar. He arranged his body in bed, phone clutched in one hand, camera feed glowing faintly on the screen. The stage was set. The predator thought he was hunting prey. But tonight, the prey had teeth. Stay with me, because what comes next will leave you breathless. If you want to see just how far betrayal can push a man, make sure you like, share, and subscribe, because Edward Miller is only getting started. Morning light spilled through the kitchen windows as Edward Miller carried out his breakfast ritual with methodical precision. The hiss of eggs in the pan, the steady rhythm of toast rising from the toaster, the warm scent of coffee drifting across the room, all of it crafted a portrait of routine. He wanted everything to appear perfectly normal. If Mark Johnson was watching him closely, Edward would make sure the performance was flawless. Rachel arrived first, her robe cinched loosely at the waist, hair still damp from her shower. She smiled at the sight of the table already set. "Morning, Dad. You didn't have to cook again." "It gives me something to do," Edward replied warmly, sliding her plate in front of her. His voice carried no trace of the storm coiled inside him. Mark entered a few minutes later, crisp and freshly groomed, playing the part of dutiful husband. He kissed Rachel's cheek, then sat down across from Edward, his eyes sharp and watchful. "Beautiful morning," Mark said casually, reaching for the coffee Edward had poured. "Any big plans for the day?" Edward buttered his toast slowly, giving himself time to study the man's face. The usual errands, a few odds and ends from the hardware store, might stop by the bank too. Mark's mask slipped for a fraction of a second, a faint twitch along his jaw. His eyes narrowed, then relaxed. "The bank?" Edward looked up mildly, feigning innocence. "Old habit, I like to check things in person. Online banking never felt reliable." Rachel laughed, unaware of the silent duel across the table. "Dad's always been paranoid about that." Edward corrected her gently. "Not paranoid. Careful." Mark leaned forward slightly. "That's smart. These days, you can't be too careful, especially with, your age and all. Scams, identity theft. People target seniors all the time." The condescension was so casual it could have passed unnoticed. Edward allowed it to wash over him without reaction. Instead, he took a slow sip of coffee, watching Mark's posture ease as though reassured. "I've been thinking about home security," Mark said after a moment. "This neighborhood seems quiet, but you never know. You mentioned that safe upstairs. Is that where you keep your important documents?" Edward met his gaze with calm resolve. "Sumermo. Some things, yes." Mark's lips curled into a faint smile. "And cash? Emergencies happen. It's always smart to keep something readily available." The audacity almost made Edward laugh. Here was a man sitting at his table, eating food from his hands, practically demanding an inventory of assets. He let silence stretch for a heartbeat before answering. "I have what I need." Rachel frowned, her fork pausing. "Mark, don't interrogate him at breakfast." "I'm just concerned," Mark said smoothly, laying down his fork as if to appear harmless. Edward mentioned he's a heavy sleeper last week. That's dangerous. I worry about older folks not waking if something happened. Edward hadn't mentioned any such thing, but he nodded anyway, his voice steady. Oh yes, once I'm asleep, I'm dead to the world. Especially lately. I've been so tired in the evenings. Relief flickered across Mark's face like sunlight breaking through clouds. He believed it. That's normal at your age, Mark said, trying to sound compassionate. Your body needs more rest. Charlie, Rachel snapped, then caught herself. Sorry, Mark. That's rude. No, he's right, Edward said quickly, playing into the role. That's why I take something to help me sleep. Knocks me right out until morning. Mark sat back, satisfied. Edward cleared the plates with practiced ease, giving them both a warm smile. I'll probably turn in early tonight. All this family activity wears me out more than I'd expected. That's a good idea, Dad, Rachel said gently. You deserve the rest. As Edward carried dishes to the sink, Mark added, almost too casually, I might stay up late tonight, watch some television in the living room. I'm a bit of a night owl. Of course he was. Edward kept his face neutral. Make yourself at home. Remote's on the coffee table. The rest of the morning passed with small talk and domestic noise, but Edward's thoughts were elsewhere. His plan required precision, and he could not afford a single misstep. Later, when Rachel began organizing their belongings in the guest room and Mark retreated to make job prospect calls, Edward excused himself for his errands. He backed out of the driveway slowly, watching through the rearview mirror as a curtain shifted upstairs. Mark was at the window, not Rachel's window, his own bedroom window. Edward tightened his grip on the wheel. Tonight could not come soon enough. At the hardware store, he walked with deliberate calm. He knew exactly what he needed: small adjustments to the glitter cannon sensitivity, extra batteries for the camera, a few ordinary items that would keep suspicions low. He lingered in the aisles longer than necessary, reviewing every angle of his plan in his mind. The trap had to be airtight. Mark believed he was clever, but desperation made men reckless. Edward would use that recklessness against him. By mid-afternoon, he returned home to find Rachel humming in the kitchen, bags of groceries scattered across the counter. Mark sat at the table scrolling through his phone, the picture of indifference. Need help, Dad? Rachel asked as Edward slipped off his jacket. No, sweetheart. Just a quick trip to the electronics store later. You two relax. He caught the flicker of interest in Mark's eyes before the younger man dropped his gaze back to the phone. Edward smiled inwardly. Mark thought he was observing the habits of a senile old man. He had no idea he was being observed in return. Upstairs, Edward set about final adjustments. The glitter cannon was secured inside the dresser drawer, calibrated perfectly. The dummy key sat gleaming like bait on a hook. The wireless camera blinked once, ready to capture everything in high definition. He stood in the center of the room, surveying his work, the trap silent and invisible. It looked like an ordinary bedroom, but beneath the surface it was a stage prepared for revelation. By evening, the table was once again set for dinner. Rachel chatted about books, neighborhood gossip, the small rhythms of ordinary life. Mark checked his phone often, impatience flickering across his face. Edward played his part flawlessly. He rubbed his temples and sighed, letting weariness soften his features. It's been a long day. I think I'll turn in early. Rachel kissed his cheek with a smile. Sleep well, Dad. Thanks, sweetheart. Mark's eyes followed him to the stairs, calm on the surface but sharp beneath. Edward could feel the weight of that stare pressing between his shoulder blades. He climbed the steps slowly, the perfect portrait of a man worn down by time. But inside his heart beat with steady anticipation. Tonight the predator would step into the snare. Tonight the truth would begin to surface. And Edward Miller was ready. At 2:43 a.m., in the trap Edward Miller had built with patience and precision finally came alive. For hours he had lain in the dark, body motionless, phone glowing faintly under the blanket as the camera feed displayed his empty bedroom. He had counted each creak of the old house, each whisper of wind outside, until the sound he'd been waiting for arrived. The faint groan of the staircase under the careful foot. Edward's breathing slowed. He forced it into a steady, heavy rhythm, the performance of deep sleep. Every muscle in his body was tense, but his face remained slack against the pillow, a mask of vulnerability. The hallway floorboard sighed, then silence, the kind of silence that wasn't absence of sound, but presence of listening. Mark Johnson was testing the waters, making sure the old man's sleeping pills had worked their magic. The doorknob turned with excruciating slowness. A silhouette filled the crack of light from the hall. Mark, draped in dark clothing, his movements deliberate, his posture dripping with predatory confidence. He stood still for nearly half a minute, watching the lump beneath the blankets. Convinced, he slipped inside. Through the barely opened door, Edward tracked his son-in-law's every step, while the camera on the nightstand captured it in perfect night vision. Mark's figure was a shadow gliding across the room, his path direct and unhesitating. He had rehearsed this in his head countless times. Tonight, he thought, was execution. He crouched at the dresser, fingers reached for the second drawer, the one Edward had prepared. The drawer slid open with ease. Mark's posture shifted, shoulders loosening as the triumph washed over him. The glint of the dummy key caught his eye. He reached inside. The explosion was magnificent. A thunderous pop split the silence as silver and gold glitter erupted in a blinding cloud. The fine dust clung to everything, his hair, his clothes, his face. Mark stumbled backward, coughing and cursing, transformed in an instant into a shimmering parody of a thief, a living disco ball in the dead of night. The confetti cannon had done its job with ruthless brilliance. Edward sat up with theatrical confusion, snapping on his bedside lamp. What on earth? His voice was groggy, bewildered, perfectly performed. Light filled the room. There stood Mark Johnson, frozen like a criminal in a spotlight. Glitter sparkled across his shirt, his eyelashes, his trembling hands. In his fist was the useless dummy key. Mark? Edward blinked, tilting his head in feigned shock. What are you doing in my bedroom? Mark's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Glitter drifted from his hair with every twitch. I heard a noise, he stammered, voice cracking. Thought someone might be breaking in. Breaking in? Edward repeated, scanning the room with a show of confusion. In here? From down the hall came the sound of bare feet slapping against the wood. Rachel's door flung open. Her voice carried panic. Dad, what was that noise? Mark's eyes went panic flashing across his glitter-stained face. Rachel appeared in the doorway, robe clutched tight, eyes widening at the sight before her. Her father sitting upright in bed, startled but unharmed. Her husband standing in his father-in-law's bedroom at 3 a.m, covered head to toe in glittering dust like a fallen star. What in God's name? Her voice caught. Mark, why do you look like that? Mark brushed at himself frantically, each movement releasing another cascade of sparkling evidence. It was some kind of trap, he muttered. Trap? Rachel's voice sharpened. In my father's dresser drawer. I was just looking for something to help him sleep, Mark blurted. He said he hasn't been resting. I thought maybe… Medicine? Edward interrupted softly, his tone cutting like steel wrapped in velvet. My medications are in the bathroom cabinet. Always have been. Silence swallowed the room. Rachel's eyes darted between her father and her husband, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning realization. So let me understand, she said slowly, her voice trembling but edged with steel. You left our bed at 3 a.m., came into my father's bedroom while he was sleeping, opened his private drawer, and set off, whatever this is? She gestured at the glitter cascading onto the carpet. Mark floundered, his glitter-coated hands clenching into fists. Why are you interrogating me like this? I'm your husband. You're my husband, Rachel said, her voice breaking. And you're standing in my father's bedroom in the middle of the night, covered in… Her eyes flicked to Edward. What is that, Dad? Glitter, Edward replied simply. Rachel turned back to Mark, her face pale. You need to tell me the truth right now. Mark swallowed hard, his throat working, but his eyes darted away, his silence louder than any confession. Edward sat calmly on the bed, watching the cracks spread through his daughter's trust. He felt no triumph, only a grim inevitability. Mark had walked straight into the snare, glitter marking him like guilt itself. And this was only the beginning. Stay with me, because the storm hasn't even broken yet. Would you forgive a betrayal like this? Or would you demand justice no matter the cost? Comment your thoughts, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe, because Edward Miller's battle for truth is just beginning. The glitter clung to Mark Johnson like judgment, every movement casting a new shimmer of evidence across the floor. He stood frozen, jaw working, while Rachel stared at him as though seeing a stranger for the first time. The silence between them was sharp enough to cut. "Explain," Rachel said finally, her voice trembling. "Tell me what you were really doing in here." Mark's glitter-coated fingers twitched at his sides. "I told you, I heard something. I came to check on your dad." "In his dresser drawer?" Her tone hardened. "At 3 in the morning?" Mark's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "I thought maybe he had something. Sleeping pills, maybe." "My medicine is in the bathroom cabinet," Edward said gently, but his eyes never left Mark's. "It always has been." The weight of the words pressed down on the room. Rachel's lips parted, then closed again. She looked at her father, then at her husband, confusion shifting into something harder, something protective. "So let me get this straight," she said slowly, her voice finding steel. "You left our bed, walked into my father's room while he was sleeping, opened his drawer, and set off this?" She gestured at the glitter still drifting to the carpet. "And I'm supposed to believe you were looking for aspirin?" Mark's voice cracked. "Why are you attacking me? I'm your husband. And he's my father," Rachel shot back. "And you're standing here with glitter all over you because you were sneaking through his private things." Edward remained silent, watching, letting the truth unravel at its own pace. He saw the moment Rachel's eyes changed, when suspicion gave way to realization. Mark saw it too. Desperation crept into his tone. "Rachel, you have to trust me. This isn't what it looks like." "It looks," she said, voice breaking, "like my husband was stealing from my father." Mark opened his mouth, but Edward chose that moment to act. He reached calmly for the phone on his nightstand, the device that held the final blow. His thumb hovered over the screen. "Rachel," he said softly, "there's something you need to hear." Mark's face drained of color beneath the glitter. "Edward, don't what?" Rachel turned on him sharply. "Don't what, Mark?" Edward pressed play. Mark's own voice filled the room, unmistakable and damning. "Yeah, it's me. Everyone's asleep. The old man's definitely loaded. I found bank statements, investment portfolios, the whole thing. We're talking serious money here." Rachel's eyes widened. She turned to Mark in horror, but the recording went on mercilessly. "Tomorrow night, Rachel's going to her book club meeting. She goes every Tuesday, 7 to 9. Gives us perfect timing. I already have the safe key. Grabbed it earlier today while they were having dinner. The old fool keeps everything important in there." Rachel clapped a hand over her mouth, a strangled sound escaping her throat. Mark lunged forward, and "Rachel, stop! He's twisting things." "Shut up," she whispered, eyes locked on the phone. "Just shut up." The recording continued, merciless in its detail. "Look, I know you're worried about the timeline, but my gambling debts aren't going away. Those guys aren't exactly patient, if you know what I mean." "Gambling debts?" Rachel's voice cracked. "What debts?" The recording didn't wait for an answer. "David's just some lonely old widower, probably grateful for the company. He has no idea what's coming. The beauty is, he'll never suspect family. Even if he figures out something's missing, Rachel will convince him he misplaced stuff. You know how old people get about their memory." The sound of her husband's sneer hung in the air like smoke. Rachel's knees weakened. She grabbed the doorframe for support. Edward stopped the recording, letting silence fall heavy. The weight of betrayal filled the room more completely than the glitter ever could. Tears slipped down Rachel's cheeks as she stared at her husband. "You called him a fool. You were going to rob my father and use me as your cover?" Mark stepped forward, voice desperate. "Rachel, listen." "No," she shouted, her voice breaking. "Don't you dare. How much do you owe?" Mark's shoulders sagged. 47,000. The number shattered what little remained of Rachel's composure. She sank against the wall, shaking her head. "You've been lying to me for months about the bills, about everything." "I was trying to protect you," Mark said, his voice rising with urgency. "I had no choice." Protect me? Rachel's eyes blazed through her tears. By planning to rob my father? By calling him names? By making me believe he was losing his memory while you stole from him? Edward stayed silent, but his chest tightened with pride at the strength in his daughter's voice. Rachel, we can fix this, Mark pleaded. We'll figure it out. Her voice cut like glass. Get out. Mark froze. What? Get out of my father's house. Her voice wavered but did not break. Now. For a long moment, Mark stood glittering in the doorway, his breath ragged, his mask of control shattered. He looked at Edward with raw hatred. This is your fault, old man. You turned her against me. Rachel straightened, her voice cold. No, Mark, you did that yourself. When you chose lies over truth, when you chose theft over honesty, when you chose to betray the only person who trusted you. Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked like a man cornered, fury and fear warring in his glitter-covered face. Finally, he turned on his heel, each step leaving a sparkling trail of his failure across the carpet. Rachel sagged into the chair by Edward's bedside, tears running freely now. Dad, I'm so sorry, she whispered. I brought him into your home. I put you in danger. Edward laid a hand on hers, his voice steady. Sweetheart, you couldn't have known. He fooled you, but he doesn't fool me anymore. What matters is you're safe now. Rachel closed her eyes, breathing shakily. Safe, she repeated, as if the word itself could rebuild the ground under her feet. Edward's gaze drifted toward the glitter still drifting in the air. Justice had begun to reveal itself. But the battle wasn't finished yet. The man Rachel had promised to love stood glittering in defeat, his lies collapsing under the weight of his own voice. The husband she thought she knew was gone, replaced by someone who had planned her father's ruin and used her as camouflage for his crimes. The room seemed smaller now, heavy with betrayal, the air itself thick with disbelief. Rachel wiped her face with the back of her hand, eyes red and shining. You plan to rob him, she whispered, her voice trembling but laced with fury. You plan to disappear with me like I was nothing but your alabita. Mark's hands twitched, glitter falling from his sleeves like snow. I had no choice. You don't understand, Rachel. Those men I owe, they don't wait. They don't forgive. You could have told me, she said, her voice cracking. We could have figured it out together. But instead, you lied. You dragged us here and tried to destroy the man who raised me. Mark stepped forward, desperate. Rachel, I love you. Everything I did was for us. Love, her laugh was broken, bitter. Love doesn't sneak into my father's room at 3 a.m. Love doesn't call him a fool behind his back. Love doesn't gamble away our lives and then try to cover it with theft. Edward sat quietly on the edge of the bed, his steady presence anchoring her. He didn't need to add words. His silence was judgment enough. Mark's desperation curdled into anger. You're siding with him. He's manipulating you. He set me up. Rachel's voice rose, raw and sharp. You set yourself up, Mark. My father didn't make you gamble. He didn't make you lie. He didn't make you betray me. That was all you. For the first time, Mark faltered. He looked at her as though searching for the woman who had once believed him, but the love in her eyes had hardened into something unmovable. Get your things, Rachel said coldly. You're done here. Mark's jaw clenched. This isn't over. Half of everything is mine. You can't just throw me out. Half of what? Rachel shot back. Half of the debt you never told me about? Half of the shame you just dumped on this family? You'll get nothing from me but the freedom to leave. Edward finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. You heard her. It's time to go. Mark turned towards him, glitter catching the lamplight like shards of broken glass. This is your fault, old man. She never would have doubted me if it weren't for you. Edward met his gaze without flinching. She doubted you because the truth finally spoke louder than your lies. The silence that followed was unbearable. Mark's chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, his eyes darting between them. Then, with a sound that was half growl, half defeated sigh, he spun on his heel and stormed from the room. The sound of drawers yanked open and clothes stuffed into bags echoed down the hall. Each slam, each frantic movement, was the sound of a life unraveling. Rachel collapsed into the chair beside Edward's bed, covering her face with her hands. Dad, how did I not see it? How did I let him get this far? Edward placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Because you loved him, and love makes us blind. That's not your fault, Rachel. She looked up, her face wet with tears but her spine straightening with resolve. Not anymore. Not after this. Down the hall, a suitcase zipper rasped like an accusation. Mark reappeared in the doorway, bags clutched in his fists, glitter still clinging to him as though the house itself refused to let him leave clean. Rachel stood, her voice steady now. Leave the key on the counter. Don't call me. Don't come back. My lawyer will contact yours. Mark sneered, his eyes hard. You think you can cut me out that easily? You'll regret this. No, Rachel said, her chin lifting. The only thing I regret is ever believing you. The words hit him like a slap. For a moment he looked ready to argue, but the sight of her unflinching face silenced him. He shoved past the threshold, tracking glitter down the hall like a trail of his disgrace. The front door slammed moments later, and his car engine roared into the night. Rachel stood trembling, staring at the empty doorway. Edward rose slowly and pulled her into his arms. She clung to him, sobbing against his chest, the weight of months of lies finally breaking loose. You're safe now, Edward whispered. He can't hurt you anymore. Rachel's voice was muffled against him. He already did. Edward tightened his embrace, his eyes burning, though no tears fell. Then we'll heal. Together. The house fell quiet again, the glitter on the floor sparkling like remnants of a storm. It was evidence of betrayal, but also proof of survival. For the first time in weeks, Edward allowed himself to believe they might find peace again. But peace would not come easily. Betrayal leaves the scars that no vacuum or broom can sweep away. Stay with me, because what follows is not just the end of a marriage. It is the rebirth of a daughter's strength and the reckoning of a man who thought an old widower was too blind to see. Like this story, share it, and subscribe so you don't miss how justice finally settles in Edward Miller's house. 3 months passed before the air inside Edward Miller's home felt truly breathable again. The silence that once carried the echo of suspicion now settled into something gentler, something that almost resembled peace. The glitter had long since been vacuumed from the floorboards, yet Edward sometimes swore he could still catch the faintest sparkle when sunlight hit a corner of the room. It was a reminder, not of shame, but of survival. Rachel had changed. The fragile woman who arrived at his door months ago with trembling hands and a hopeful smile was gone. In her place stood someone quieter, steadier, her eyes touched by sorrow but also by a newfound strength. The divorce papers had been signed, the process finalized without much fight. Mark Johnson had taken what little he could claim, leaving behind a trail of bitterness that no longer belonged to them. Rachel poured herself into work at the local library, finding solace among the rows of books in the steady rhythm of shelving, cataloging, and helping strangers discover stories that soothed them. Edward noticed how her shoulders seemed lighter each evening when she came home, how her smile, still hesitant at times, carried a trace of the woman she used to be. One evening, as the first cool winds of autumn rattled the trees, Edward prepared dinner while Rachel arrived later than usual. She set her bag down with a soft sigh and leaned against the kitchen doorway. You've been cooking too much again, she said, her tone gently teasing. Edward turned from the stove, ladle in hand, and smiled. Old habits. Besides, you look tired. Someone has to keep you fed. Rachel's lips curved upward faintly. It was busy today. We had a whole class of kids come in for a reading program. Loud, chaotic, but good. I haven't laughed that much in weeks. Her words carried a light Edward hadn't heard in far too long. He set the ladle down and studied her quietly. You're healing, he said softly. Rachel crossed the room and hugged him, her arms tight, her face pressed against his shoulder. Because of you, she whispered. If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't seen through him. Edward shook his head. No, sweetheart. You found the strength to face the truth. I just helped you see it. They sat down to dinner, the clink of silverware filling the silence between words. For the first time, Edward didn't feel the need to watch his guests' every move. For the first time, Rachel's laughter didn't sound forced. Later, after dishes were stacked neatly in the sink, they sat on the porch with mugs of tea, the night sky stretching clear above them. The street was quiet, save for the occasional bark of a mine or the hum of a passing car. Rachel cradled her mug, staring at the stars. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked softly. Edward sipped his tea, considering. "I think about what he tried to do, about the arrogance of it. But him, personally? No. He made his choices, and he's gone." Rachel nodded, her eyes glistening in the starlight. "I thought I loved him, Dad. I really did. I thought we were building a life together." "You did love him," Edward said gently. "That was never the problem. He just wasn't worthy of it." Her breath trembled as she exhaled. "I feel like such a fool." Edward reached over, covering her hand with his own. "Being fooled doesn't make you a fool. It makes you human. What matters is what you do after the truth comes out." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that carried comfort rather than fear. For Edward, it was enough just to sit beside his daughter, both of them alive, both of them free of the poison that had nearly consumed their home. In the weeks that followed, Rachel continued to rebuild her life. She made new friends at the library, joined a small book club of her own, and even started writing short essays that she kept hidden in a notebook by her bed. Edward caught glimpses of her scribbling late at night, her pen scratching furiously across the page, and though she never offered to share, he never pressed. It was her way of stitching herself back together, one word at a time. For Edward, healing looked different. He mended it through routine, fixing the squeaky stair, repainting the front door, tending to the small garden out back that his late wife had once adored. Each task gave him purpose, grounding him in the present instead of the shadows of betrayal. Neighbors, curious at first about the sudden disappearance of Mark, had started to notice subtle changes. The glint of a new security camera by the porch, the sturdier lock on the back door. And though Edward never spoke of the glitter-filled night, whispers traveled. Some speculated, others chuckled knowingly. He didn't correct them, let them think what they would. The truth belonged only to those who had lived it. One afternoon, a neighbor passing by paused at the fence, smiling. "Heard you've got some new kind of, home security, Ed. Something unusual?" Edward smiled faintly, leaning on the fence post. "Let's just say anyone who tries their luck here leaves brighter than they came." The neighbor laughed, shaking his head. "Guess I'll keep my distance then." Edward chuckled, but inside he felt something steadier, something stronger. He had taken what should have been a story of weakness, a predator circling an old man, and turned it into one of survival. He had shown that age was not an invitation to be prey. As autumn deepened and leaves turned gold, Edward realized the house no longer felt haunted. It was, once again, a place of safety, filled with the simple, quiet rhythms of family and trust. Rachel's voice drifted through the halls with warmth rather than worry, and his own heart carried gratitude rather than suspicion. Peace had not come quickly. It had not come easily. But it had come. And Edward Miller, though scarred by betrayal, knew that both he and his daughter were stronger now than they had ever been. The first frost of winter traced delicate patterns on Edward Miller's windows, catching the early morning light like crystal veins. He stood by the glass with a steaming cup of coffee, the house quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock. For the first time in months, there was no heaviness pressing against his chest. The storm had passed, leaving him and Rachel in its wake, wounded, yeah, but alive and stronger for it. Rachel padded softly into the kitchen, her robe drawn tight against the cold. She smiled faintly when she saw him standing there. "You're up early again," she said, reaching for her own mug. "Old habits," Edward replied, his voice calm. "Sleep doesn't come as easily as it used to." She joined him at the window, sipping in silence, watching the quiet street where a neighbor's dog sniffed the frosted lawn. After a moment, she said, "I had another dream last night. About him." Edward glanced at her, patient. Rachel's eyes were distant. In the dream, he wasn't covered in glitter. He was just himself, smiling like nothing ever happened. It almost felt real until I woke up and remembered. Edward set down his cup. "Memories are stubborn. They don't leave just because we want them to. But dreams can't hurt you, not anymore." Rachel turned to him, her eyes shining. "You saved me, Dad, not just from him, but from staying blind. I think about that night, how easily I might have believed his excuses if you hadn't shown me the truth." Edward reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. You saved yourself, Rachel. You found the courage to see him for what he was. Her lips trembled, but she smiled through it. Still, I'll never forget the sound of that recording. Hearing his voice say those things. Hearing how little I meant to him. Edward's eyes softened. Sometimes the cruelest gift is the truth. It hurts, but it frees us. Later that day, Rachel busied herself at the library, while Edward tended to his modest garden despite the chill. The soil was hard, the air sharp with the promise of snow, but he worked steadily, pruning the last of the dead branches, readying the earth for spring. Each careful cut felt symbolic, removing rot to make space for growth. As he worked, neighbors passed and waved. Some stopped to chat, asking about Rachel, remarking on how strong she seemed these days. Edward accepted their kind words with a quiet nod, but he didn't elaborate. The ordeal belonged to them alone. That evening, as twilight deepened, Rachel joined him on the porch. She carried a small notebook, its pages filled with her writing. She didn't read from it, but she set it beside her chair, an unspoken acknowledgement of how she, too, was finding her way back. Do you ever think about justice? She asked suddenly. Edward tilted his head. All the time. I mean real justice, she clarified. Mark walked away without handcuffs, without prison. It feels wrong sometimes, like he didn't pay enough for what he did. Edward considered her words, then exhaled slowly. Justice doesn't always come from courts or police reports. Sometimes it comes from truth revealing itself at the right moment. Sometimes it's as simple as watching a liar stand in a room full of glitter, unable to hide what he really is. Rachel laughed softly, the sound fragile but genuine. I'll never forget that image. It's burned into my memory. Edward's smile was small but steady. Then maybe that's justice too, the kind that follows him everywhere. Every time he looks in the mirror, he'll remember the night he was exposed. And every time we look at each other, we'll remember we survived. Silence settled comfortably between them, broken only by the creak of the porch and the faint hum of the street. The world beyond their door felt steady again, ordinary in its rhythm. Rachel leaned against her father's shoulder. Thank you, Dad, for everything, for saving me from a life I didn't even realize was falling apart. Edward's arms circled her gently. That's what fathers do. We protect, even when our children don't see the danger yet. The stars blinked awake above them, cold and clear. Edward thought about the long nights of doubt, the careful planning, the moment the trap had sprung. It had been a battle fought not with fists, but with patience, cunning, and the quiet resilience of a man underestimated by someone too arrogant to see his strength. He smiled faintly to himself. Justice, he thought, doesn't always thunder down in courtrooms or echo in prison cells. Sometimes justice sparkles, bright and undeniable, clinging to those who would rather hide in shadows. Rachel's breathing softened against his shoulder, steady now, unburdened. Edward closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. The fight was over. They were free, man, and as long as they faced tomorrow together, that would always be enough.